Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. This is going to be something of a perfunctory recent reads video, a video wherein I talk about the books that I have been reading lately. But since I have made, I think, numerous videos about these books, I'll try to skim over them briefly. Actually, before I get into the books I have been reading, let me talk a little bit about one of the books that I did not read. I'm calling it a DNS, did not start, trying to invent a new booktube term akin to DNF, meaning did not finish or do not finish. I'm not quite sure what it is exactly. But there is a difference between not starting something and not finishing something. And in this case, it didn't take me very long to decide that this was not the book for me. And let me read you the first little bit more than a page, and then I'll tell you what displeased me about it. Let me tell you about when I was a girl, our grandfather says. It is Saturday evening. We always stay at their house on Saturdays. The couch and the chairs are shoved back against the walls. The teak coffee table from the middle of the room is up under the window. The floor has been cleared for the backward and forward somersaults, the juggling with oranges and eggs, the how to do a cartwheel, how to stand on your head, how to walk on your hands lessons. Our grandfather holds us upside down by the legs until we get our balance. Our grandfather worked in a circus before he met and married our grandmother. He once did headstands on top of a whole troop of headstanders. He once walked a tightrope across the Thames. The Thames is a river in London, which is 527 miles from here, according to the mileage chart in the RAC book in among our father's books at homes. Oh, across the Thames, was it? Our grandmother says. Not across the falls at Niagara? Ah, Niagara, our grandfather says. Now that was a whole other kettle of fish. I dislike the intense striving for voice. I don't know if it was Faulkner that started that trend in American literature. I don't know that this is American literature either, but where the narrator has to have an excessive voice. I like my stories told straightforward and flat of affect. So immediately reading that little portion, I knew that I could not continue with this. It's a beautiful copy of a book, and I will take it to the neighborhood box. I can't begrudge getting a book that I don't like when the neighborhood box provides so many free offerings. So let me move into the meat of the video, as some booktubers have been wont to say. I started with Eileen Chang, Love in a Fallen City, the city being Hong Kong, and these stories are of the type that I was contrasting that snippet with, straightforward telling. When I was young, I read and fell in love with the short stories of W. Somerset Maugham, and reading these stories made me realize that I may never read his stories again, because Eileen Chang has other books of stories out there, and why read or reread something by Somerset Maugham when you can read something new to you by Eileen Chang? These stories are set in pre-reversion Hong Kong. I was there once before Hong Kong went back to the mainland. I was also there once almost immediately after the transfer. And it was a very different Hong Kong to what it has become. Now, where Mom wrote stories detailing one side of the colonial experience, these stories approach it from a different side. The colonial aspect is not a main feature in the stories, but it is there as an inevitable backdrop. The stories are mainly about families. So you have a young woman who moves in with her aunt, an aunt which has fallen into somewhat disrepute with the rest of the family, and then what ensues. There is a story called The Golden Kang, Kang being the instrument of restraint. So our equivalent would be something like the golden handcuffs. And the stories have all been translated by Karen S. Kingsbury, and they're very smooth flowing, with the exception of that story, The Golden Kang, which was translated by the author herself. And so the rhythm of the story feels a little bit more stilted or sluggish. And I found it hard to understand what was going on in the story. In fact, I wound up going to Wikipedia and reading a synopsis of the story. And then as soon as I saw the synopsis, I was able to return to the story and go with it and had no problems thenceforth. The story is in two parts. And the first part, I was completely lost. And then I checked out what was happening. And then for the second part, I was with the narrator the whole way. The diversity of characters, the diversity of situations is remarkable. In all, I would say the stories are somewhat downers, with the exception of the title story, which is very much a life-affirming story. But these really describe the human experience. And as I say, I look forward to reading more of her stories in the future. I have Lust, Caution on its way, which I believe is also a collection of stories, that being the title of one of the stories in the collection. I also read a couple of novels by Edith Wharton, or novella, you might say. This is fairly short. Ethan Frome. I don't know if you say Frome or Frome. It's spelled Frome, so I guess I'll say Frome. And this was a nice story. It's almost a parable of some sort. Very few characters. Now, Wharton has been criticized that the characters don't seem like real people because she is writing out of her milieu. She was of high society in New York, and she's writing about poor farmers in New England. Be that as it may, I had no trouble with the lack of delineation of the characters. They seemed almost like archetypes to me. And the story, as I say, was very pared down. There was not an extraneous matter in the plot, in the characterization, in the description. It proceeded to its end with haste, and it was a tragic end, but nevertheless, a very satisfying read. The book that I followed up with was, and I should say both of the Wharton I listened to on audiobooks at LibriVox, and I'll put a link in the description to those narrated versions so you can find them. I highly recommend Elizabeth Klett, who did the narration. So then I went with The House of Mirth, which is one of her earlier novels. This is a Signet edition, which I checked out as an ebook from the public library. I own a Penguin edition somewhere that has vanished. I read the introduction to the Signet Classic. It's a 100th anniversary edition. Most of the way through, and thought it was a very good introduction. But then I finished the novel and didn't bother going back to it. I still could, but I don't feel a need. And that story is very different. Wharton is in her element, dealing with the highfalutin, high society, gentlefolk, mostly in New York. And though the lot of them is pretty unappealing, the main character is very sympathetic. You get the portrait of a young woman who sees very little option for herself other than to find a husband. And as she is not one of the uber rich, she is very constrained in her role within the society. So she winds up being something of a hanger-on or a sponge to the uber wealthy, and assists them with tasks like addressing envelopes or writing thank you notes, that kind of thing. And then she has a chance to marry a very wealthy young man, and that does not quite work out, and then the story devolves from there. It's a also somewhat tragic tale, no doubt true to life in a lot of circumstances, and the course of action is inexorable. By the time you reach the fatal conclusion, you realize that there was little option for her to maneuver out of that tight spot because of the rigorous strictures placed upon everybody within that world. Now, it's not a world that I particularly enjoy being in, but as I say, the main character was very sympathetic. And whereas Ethan Frome and the Wharton novel I read previous to that, The Age of Innocence, focused on young men, the central focus on a young woman here was very much appreciated for a change. So, in the midst of all of that, I read some of this book about Moses Finley, who is an ancient historian, was an ancient historian. I believe he died in 1986. I could be wrong by a few years. And I've done a video just yesterday, perhaps, or the day before, talking about this book in considerable detail. I highly recommend it if you want to learn about Moses Finley himself. But of course, reading his own books is probably to be preferred to a biography or biographical. So, pardon me, my my throat is catching. Biographical tidbits such as you might glean from something of this sort. So it has been a very fulfilling set of books. This being unexpected because I am requiring myself to read only fiction for a window of 2 months, and I accidentally poked my nose into this and then could not pull myself out from it. But now I will return to fiction. I believe I am going to begin next Troubles by J.G. Farrell, about which I know nothing, but it was a recent acquisition when I was up in Evanston. So I will leave this video here and talk to you again soon. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.